Okay, so welcome everyone to the final webinar of this week's series. So this webinar is a collaboration between the African Society of Human Genetics and Science Foundation Ireland Centre for Research Training in Genomics Data Science. So just to give some background on the CRT in Genomics Data Science, we're a PhD training program with over 150 genomics data science group leaders across 7 Irish universities with the aim of training 100 PhD students. So in the first 3 months of a student's PhD, we run what's called a residential training program where all the students attend the University of Galway and undertake training in genomics data science. They then go on to enroll in their university of choice and finish their PhDs. And this webinar serves as a keynote in a week-long set of masterclasses, which are run by the African Society of Human Genetics trainers, where they deliver in-person, hands-on kind of data analysis and the applications of genomics research to African health. So we have another really exciting talk lined up today from Dr. Lichongwe Cynthia Manong, who's a senior lecturer in the Division of Human Genetics. She is a bioethics researcher and is currently involved in research related to the equitable governance of global health research consortia and many other areas pertaining to the ethical issues in genomics research and big data in Africa. She is involved in the H3 Africa Consortium and is currently supported and overseeing the ethics portfolio for the Sickle Africa Data Coordinating Center. So Dr. Manong, if you're ready, we can begin.
Great. Thank you, Declan. Just to confirm, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. Thanks for the introduction and for the invitation to be part of this webinar. And good afternoon to all the attendees, and thank you for joining. So today we will just look at the ethical, legal, and social aspects of genomics research in Africa. And I will draw especially from work that has been done in the H3 Africa Consortium, and I will be biased towards the work that has been done in our group. The presentations will showcase some publications from researchers across Africa, and that is because there is not sufficient time to discuss that in detail. But if attendees are interested in some of those topics, then they can pick up from there. So over the past 4 days of this webinar, we've had the previous speakers, Professor Wonka, Professor Anayo, Professor Fatumo, and Professor Happy talk about genomics research in Africa as a scientific and as an ethical imperative, and why we must include genomics, why we must include populations in Africa in genomic studies. I think Prof. Fatumo and Happy talked about the importance of community engagement, and Professor Wonkham stressed about the need for a genetic workforce in Africa and the return of incidental or individual genetic findings. So we'll touch on some of that and build on some of the things they've discussed in the course of this webinar. So the ethical issues raised by genomics research span across different areas. We have to look at it from the genomics to biology aspect of it, genomics to health, and genomics to society. So the NIH sort of highlighted what they consider to be the grand challenges for ethical issues in genomics much more broadly. And they categorize that into four broad groups: genomics and sociocultural values, genomics at institutional and systems level, ethical issues at the level of research, design, and implementation, and then at the level of translation in terms of genomics healthcare. And these four these four categories, you have different ethical issues that will come up, and some are cross-cutting across the different categories. The World Economic Forum has also charted the ethical issues for genomic data policy. They call it the ethical tensions, and it's grouped into four. Four broad ethical tensions in genomic data policy, according to the World Economic Forum. The issues of consent, issues of data privacy, data access, and benefit sharing. And I think, yeah, the broader issue is around individual privacy versus societal benefits, and the need to balance that, and the need to balance open and restricted data access. So if we really need to do genomics research, we need to share data, but what models will work? Should we do open data sharing, or should it be restricted? Or do we need to balance that? And then there is also the need to balance receiving benefits and altruistic donations, especially from the side of research participants or patients. And so broadly, these are the ethical issues in genomics research, and I've grouped them into micro-level ethical issues, such as informed consent, privacy and confidentiality, stigma and discrimination, the return of results, research integrity, and then macro-level ethical issues, which touches on questions around inequitable partnerships in genomics research in Africa, health inequities, especially in terms of access, our equity-based responsibilities, benefit sharing, and at the level of research and development, questions around commercialization, intellectual property rights, and patents. And so I will touch on some of these in the course of this presentation. These ethical issues can be addressed in a variety of ways. It could be through community engagement. It could be through compliance to regulatory requirements, equitable governance, adopting a patient, or if we like, a community or a public-centric approach to genomics research in Africa, and public engagement. So I will also just touch on some of these together with the ethical issues. So let's start with informed consent, which is around the respect for participants' autonomy. And what I want to draw our attention to here is the different types of consent models that have been discussed in genomics research in Africa, and mainly in terms of which consent model would be more appropriate. So we've talked about specific consent, which is much more restricted, but which gives the participants much more control over their data or samples. And an argument has been made for tiered consent as well. Broad consent is also has also been supported in genomics research initiatives across Africa. And what I want to say is that a number of African countries really, the guidelines or the regulations for a number of African countries are not clear whether they will support or they will not support broad consent. But there is the issue of tiered consent, which gives participants much more control over how they want their data to be used. But there is an emerging issue of dynamic consent and whether that should be considered in genomics research in Africa, particularly in data sharing or secondary uses of data and samples. That hasn't been discussed much within the continent, but I think it is an issue that needs to be looked at. A big issue for genomics research in Africa has been the comprehension of study information as presented in the consent forms. And a number of studies have looked at research participants' understanding of the information that is provided to them in consent forms. And I just draw from an example from an informed consent study that was conducted in Cameroon. It was for a tuberculosis genetic study that's taking place in 4 different African countries. But this study focused on the Cameroon side. And what were the factors that were influencing comprehension of consent information for genetic studies? There is the issue of diagnostic miscomprehension or diagnostic misconception, sorry about it, where participants tend not to see it as research, but see it as an opportunity for diagnosis. Then there is the question of situational vulnerability, because many participants tend not to have access to diagnostic services or to genetic diagnostic services, then or they are seeking for someone to pay to cover cost for that service, then they tend not to focus on the content of their consent forms, but to seek more to get that particular service. Then there was the issue of limited public genetic literacy. So many participants did not understand concepts around genetics, gene biobanking, data sharing, and which is really interesting for us because a rationale for selecting that particular site was because a lot of genetic studies have taken place and a lot of investment had gone into community engagement for genetics research. And therefore, there was the expectation that participants would have some knowledge, at least, of issues around genetics. Then there is the issue of information overload. So because consent forms want to cover a variety of topics, to cover issues around biobanking, to explain what the study is about, to try and also explain genetics and all of that, then the consent forms tend to have so much information that participants do not have time or find it difficult to digest all that information in the course of before they provide consent. But one way to avoid some of these issues is to increase contact time with participants. And we could do that through community engagement. So over the past few days, the previous speakers have talked about how they've integrated community engagement in their genetic studies. And they've talked about it in the context of buy-in, but we see it also as a way of increasing contact time with potential participants or potential study or the study communities to ensure that they have an idea of the risk and the benefits of genomic studies. And Tindana and colleagues did a review of community engagement strategies for genomic studies in Africa. And different approaches are being used for community engagement. There is information feedback, consultation, community involvement, and collaboration. So those are the 3 dominant ones. And the strategies that are being used include community advisory boards, where you have representatives of the communities, town hall meetings, and focus group discussions. What I want to just highlight also for community engagement is that while it is a way of getting buy-in, of building trust, there is the ethics of community engagement that as researchers, when we design our research projects and when we integrate community engagement as a critical part of our studies, we must also reflect on the ethics of our community engagement practices. And one is the power dynamics, to look at when we go into the community, what dynamics is there, and at the end of the day, is it a one-directional approach? And the message there is to ensure that we are able to share power and we are able to learn. There is bi-directional learning, and that we are active listeners in the process. Stigma and discrimination is one of the micro-level ethical issues in genomics, and the concerns are around the possibility that genetic databases may be used by insurance or for forensic purposes, and that could in turn lead to discrimination. There is the question of gendered blame, especially for monogenetic conditions. There is the possibility of ethnic group harm, and sort of at the end of the day, whether we want to balance individual liberties or the public good when we do genetic research. But I think the take-home message there is that genomics research needs to be culturally competent to minimize risk of harm. The return of genetic results and the reporting of findings. And the bigger questions there are what results need to be returned. And this is in terms of determining the pathogenicity in African genomes. And do researchers really have an obligation to feed back incidental or individual findings? There is also the question of determining actionability and clinical relevance of the results that we want to return. And in terms of actionability, the argument is that we may have an obligation to return individual findings or incidental findings, especially if some action can be taken. But recent studies are also showing that even if action can't be taken, it could lead to diagnostic closure. So for example, a study on the return of incidental findings for a Fragile X study in Cameroon showed that participants just wanted to know the results. It just led to diagnostic closure, like they were happy to know that at last this is the cause of our child's illness. And so there is an issue of epistemic justice. It's the right to know. And then who should return results? Prof. Wonkem said during the first day of this webinar that there is a limited genetic workforce in Africa, there's limited genetic counselors. So who should return results? Because all that is needed so that participants are provided with results accompanied by counseling and what they can do with those results. Then privacy is also a micro-level ethical issue in genomics. And not much has been written on privacy in genetics research in Africa. And there is really limited empirical studies. But with many countries passing data protection laws across Africa, it is hoped that much attention will be given to questions of privacy in genetics research. And now we move to the macro level justice issues or ethical issues in genetics. One that has been discussed so far, and I don't think there is need to really emphasize on that again, is the equitable collaborations in genomics research in Africa. The need to give African researchers a voice in genetics research in Africa, not only as for them to be researchers, but for them to be able to set the agenda, to define the priorities for genomics research in Africa. And so much has been said about collaborations between the global North and the global South, and how we need to ensure that we don't create spaces for helicopter research, or that and that these relationships are built on mutual exchange of experience and skills. What I would love to also say here is that we should be mindful of South-South collaborations. That we are all in the South doesn't mean that our collaborations are necessarily equitable. And so we should always think, even within our South-South collaborations, which are encouraged anyway, that who has more power, and it could be between different countries. Some countries have much more resources and are able to do research more than others. And even within the same country, if we take South Africa, for example, the resources at the University of Cape Town and the resources at the University of Venda, it's not the same. And so even in that kind of partnership, we should be intentional about ensuring that it is equitable. So equity in South-South collaborations is really key, and it's something that we need to start talking about much more. Then there are ethical issues around the sharing of data. At the level of researchers, it is still the question of equity. And I want to emphasize again that it's not only about equity in North-South collaborations. There are these issues even for South-South collaborations. We've seen even within countries where people are unwilling to share data, and we've seen even across Africa where people are unwilling to share data because the fear that the collaboration is not necessarily equitable. And so the question is, what models of data sharing should we use that will be considered equitable or researchers will find much more comfortable with? Should we go for open sharing, which I think that would be a good thing for the benefit of science? But then there is also questions around ensuring that researchers with less resources are able to gain some benefits. Should we go for restricted access, or should we go for a federated model? And I'll talk about the federated model much more later. And who benefits when we share the genetic data? At the level of research participants, the ethical issues are around how should data be used, and should participants be given a voice in how their genetic or health data should be used for research. We are all familiar with the centralized, the restricted, and the open data sharing models. But the federated data model is gaining light at this point, and the World Economic Forum has proposed a model for federated data governance. And they describe it as a very promising way to enable access to health data, including genomic data that remains inside a country or that needs to remain inside a country or institution because of their sensitivity or because of unwillingness to share for several reasons. But the core of it is to build trust. And I think that this is one model that we need, that researchers may want to explore further to facilitate data sharing processes until we're able to establish equitable platforms where people are willing and to share without fears of being exploited, or as we move more towards the open sharing model. The broader ethical questions in genomics research center around justice, and there are questions of intellectual properties and intellectual property rights and patents, ownership of genetic data, access to genomic medicine and other benefits of genomics, and that's again bring us back to the issue of a possible genomics divide and why, again, African populations should be involved in genetics. But there is also the issue of access to genetic medicine services, both globally and within countries. And then there is the issue of benefit sharing. In the interest of time, I will not touch on these, but let me look at two of these questions of genomic justice: access to genomics medicine and benefit sharing. So benefit sharing remains a very thorny issue in genomics research in Africa. And while everyone really tends to agree that there is a need to establish benefit sharing models, it's not really clear how its implementation can be done. So in this study, we asked genomics researchers in Africa. We wanted to gain some understanding of the awareness and expectations of genomics researchers in Africa around issues of benefit sharing. So we first asked them, what would be the justification for benefit sharing? Why should we have benefit sharing mechanisms in place? And their arguments for why benefit sharing is important centered around fairness, solidarity, and reciprocity. So it was about the need to give back and the need to ensure that all populations around the world are able to access the benefits of genetics. What we struggled with was the types of benefit sharing. But there are two main types of benefit sharing that came up from the interviews. There was the issue of capacity building and the sharing of profits, which was interesting, but it's the Human Genome Organization had actually proposed a benefit sharing approach, which means giving back 1 to 3% of the profits of genomics research back to the study communities. And when we asked African genomics researchers in Africa what they thought about this benefit sharing model, every one of our participants said that it was important, but that they will even ask more than the 3% proposed by the Human Genome Organization. Now, the bigger question is who should decide what type of benefit should be shared and the benefit sharing model. I think the easier answer from the interviews was that the communities should decide. But who is this community? If you look at how genetic studies are designed, who would you consider the community? But despite being a very thorny issue in genetic research, there are many initiatives that are trying to design models for benefit sharing. And so there is this company, and it is a case in South Africa, Variant Bio, that has announced it's a formal commitment to benefit sharing. And they say that they are committed to sharing tangible benefits with their research partners. So Variant Bio is a commercial company, and they partner with universities to do research. So it's a clear example of a public-private partnership. So their benefit sharing model include the return of results, and that will be immediate. They're doing community-driven projects. That's short-term after sample collection is completed. And to note that these community-driven projects are not necessarily linked to genetics. So it could be like a cookbook recipe, and that's defined a recipe book, and that's defined by the community, for example, or whether it's a borehole, so the community decides. They are also very committed to sharing revenue, and they have made a commitment to give 4% of their revenue for interventions that is developed from the use of the data that they will collect from populations in South Africa. They're also committed to sharing 4% of their equity value with the partner communities that they will be working with, and that 10% of the overall study budget would be given back to the community in terms of for benefit sharing activities. So there is a lot we can learn from that. And of course, some of these are questionable, and I don't put it as a model that can't be discussed, or that doesn't raises issues. But I think that it really gives us a good example of how to think about benefit sharing, and whether when we design genetic projects, we should be thinking also of assigning a proportion of our budgets towards sharing benefits with the with communities, and whether return of results should really be integrated in all genetic projects. Access to genomic medicine and other benefits of genomics. So across Africa, there is an interest in setting up genetic services. And that is really, that's a good thing to see, because at least we see that people will benefit from the outcomes of genetic research. And so far, I think what's dominant are genetic screening programs. And if we look at this study, conducted by Wanchem and others in Cameroon on prenatal diagnosis for sickle cell disease. While that was a service that was really well appreciated by research participants and the public health ministry, there was the ethical questions that came out of it, not necessarily in terms of acceptability or saying that it's not a good service, but really in terms of cultural sensitivity. Like when we do genetic screening programs, how likely are people to accept those results, and how do we give them return those results, and the importance to be sensitive to cultural values and beliefs around a particular disease itself, and the solutions that we are providing. Then access and cost to genetic services is also a huge issue that we can shy away from, especially for new technologies. There is already interest in gene editing and gene therapy, but have we really thought about what proportion of the population is able to access that, and how many are able to pay for that? Then there is the issue of coverage. So far, these services are available in tertiary facilities, mainly in urban areas, and also provided as part of research. And most of this research is taking place in universities, in urban areas. So access both to research and to genetic medicine services is a huge issue. And then there is the question of developing a cohort of medical geneticists and genetic counselors that can man genetic medicine services in Africa, if we really are interested in ensuring equitable access. So before I mentioned different ethical issues, macro level ethical issues, and I said I wouldn't talk about that in the interest of time. There was the issue of commercialization, intellectual property, benefit sharing, equitable collaborations, and others. Then the need to build capacity and African intellectual leadership. So the H3 Africa Consortium started working towards a governance model. They wanted to identify a model framework for the governance of genomics research and biobanking in Africa. And in the discussions leading to that framework, there was an interest in developing a framework that is inspired by communal or solidarity-based worldviews. So these are worldviews that are dominant in sub-Saharan Africa. And so they wanted a framework that is grounded in principles of solidarity, reciprocity, and consultation, and that will touch on issues of African intellectual leadership, broad consent, community engagement, avoiding group harm and stigma, benefit sharing, capacity building, and equitable international collaborations. And the question there was, what philosophical grounding should such a framework have? And many people wanted it to be grounded in Ubuntu, which is a Southern African philosophy or a way of life. And then the discussions turn around, but why, if it's a framework for Africa, why focus on a Southern African philosophy? So we took up work from there, and we said, let's look at Ubuntu. What is it that Ubuntu can bring to inform equity-oriented governance of genomics research in Africa? And is it necessarily a Southern African philosophy? And so we did some conceptual analysis, and it turns out that Ubuntu, the concept of Ubuntu, is found in countries across Africa. It just has different names. And on this slide, the funny looking diagram there just shows different ways in which the concept of Ubuntu is described in different African countries. So what is the African worldview? And the center of it is solidarity and reciprocity. It's simply saying that I am because you are, and therefore we should be able to share the resources that we have for the benefit of mankind. So in this slide, you'd see what Ubuntu will mean for or what's called in different countries across Africa. And so that made Ubuntu a very appealing moral framework to ground the governance of genomics research in Africa without thinking that it is much more regional. So we went ahead and said, okay, we now have Ubuntu, but let's look, we don't want to develop a framework that speaks only to African values. We want a global framework. And so we said, let's compare Ubuntu to other frameworks for the governance of global health. And so we looked at shared health governance and the global governance of health. So we used, we did some conceptual analysis and empirical work. And the results of that is what we have on the slide, different principles for the governance of genomics if we want an equitable governance of genomics research in Africa in terms of the different ethical issues that I've highlighted before. I wouldn't have time to go through these different principles, but it is around the importance of furthering health justice. What would be the priorities for genomics research in Africa? Sorry. It would be about the need to share power and to share decision-making, the importance to reflect, to self-reflect on our equity-oriented responsibilities, and then to think of our solidarity, the communal unity based on shared goals to ensure that populations in Africa and around the world are able to access the benefits of genomics. So what I would like to talk about is the next frontier. So much work has gone into genomics research in Africa, and I've only highlighted a few. And like I said in the beginning, I'm quite biased towards work that has been done at H3 Africa and in our own group, but that's also because it's easier to talk about work that you have followed across for a long time. So based on all the work that has been done, what do we see as the next frontier in terms of ethical and social aspects and African genetic research? I think at this stage, we need to look at mutual accountability. And the question there is, for all the different stakeholders, what are our equity-oriented responsibilities towards preventing a genomics divide, towards ensuring that populations in Africa and around the world are able to access the benefits of genetic research? And that's a question that can only be answered by each one of us, depending on which stakeholder group we fall on. So it is an issue for researchers, especially African researchers. I think my call here is for African researchers to ask, what are our equity-oriented responsibilities when it comes to genetic research? What are we doing to ensure that populations in Africa are not harmed by genetic research and that they are able to access the benefits of genetic research? And to the public also to say, what are we doing as the general public to ensure access? Should we participate in genetic research? Should we opt for the sharing of genetic data? Should we be more engaged in discussions around genetics? And also for biotech and innovation companies. And again, the call there is to reflect on how can these companies support equitable access. Then there is the issue, I think one of the next frontier is working towards moving from genetic research to the clinic. And the ethical issue there is equity in access. So we need to build a genetic workforce in Africa. There is the need to develop benefit sharing models and to think about questions of cost to access for genetic medicine services. I think we need to look at public-private partnerships. They are key to ensuring translation, but there is quite a number of ethical issues that need to be addressed. And that how do we get our policymakers to actually invest in genetic medicine services? One big frontier for the ethics of genetic medicine in Africa is public engagement. And I think it's time that we really, really invest time, effort, and money in public engagement. And it's on two fronts. We need to engage the public on the importance of genetic databases of genetic databases. And the second is to engage the public in the use of their genetic data. And what we are learning is that we need a public-centric approach for genetic research in Africa. We need to give the public a voice in how their genetic data should be used. We also need to give them a voice about setting priorities for genetic research in Africa. But we also need to listen to them about what they consider to be the ethical issues. So it's sort of a way of democratizing science, because I think much of the discussions they've happened within the academic space, and we need to take those discussions out and really hear from the public what they consider to be the ethical issues. What are their concerns around genetics? What are the benefits? What do they think about genetic databases? So it's all about democratizing science. So it's about moving genomics, moving these discussions from academic spaces to the public. And on this slide, I've just highlighted some of the work we are doing in terms of public engagement for our group. So for our sickle cell project, we've developed a portal where we are simply explaining the sickle cell disease project to children, and the target group there is children from 5 to 12 years. And the emphasis there is to say that we need to engage every sector of the public. It shouldn't be limited to a particular group. And recently, we brought high school learners and representing the youths to look at knowledge transition, to say what is it that the youths are thinking about when it comes to genomics and genetics research, especially in terms of the ethical issues. And we continue to engage patients, to center patients in everything we do, to consider them as partners, not necessarily as research participants. So I just want to thank the African Society of Human Genetics and the Center for Research Training in Genomics and Data Science in Ireland for inviting me to give this talk. Thank you to our funders and to all of you who made it to this webinar.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. There was plenty of food for thought. So I think we have a comment from Lisa Roberts in the chat. Incidental findings by their nature are not related to the disorder disease in question, so they are unlikely to impact the diagnostic odyssey. More likely, they are surprise news to the participants, given one, the lack of capacity to interpret variants of unknown significance due to the many novel variants in African genomes, and two, lack of genetic cancers on the continent. Many questions whether return of incidental findings is practical or possible. What are your thoughts?
Great. I think Lisa makes a good point there. And that is about actionability, right? Should we take action for incidental findings? I think we should, if we actually look at it with a social justice lens. And sometimes that action, like I said, for the Fragile X study in Cameroon, is just to get diagnostic closure. There is nothing that can be done. And true, it is an incidental finding. We didn't really seek to, it wasn't the purpose of the study, right? But if we find that and we see, and if it is of clinical relevance, because another issue is that, is it of clinical relevance? If we see that it is of clinical relevance, I think if we use a social justice lens, it will be necessary to provide that result so that people can take action, or sometimes just to get closure. But again, I see the point that Lisa makes for a workforce, the limited number of genetic counselors to be able to provide counseling when they return that result. And I think that is the next frontier for genetics research in Africa, to build that workforce so that individual and incidental findings can be provided to participants in a way that is acceptable.
Great, thank you. I have a question on kind of data sharing. So obviously research kind of thrives the more open data is, but do you think there should be like a moratorium on sharing for the kind of a brief period, so you don't open up the door to, you know, being exploited by sharing too soon? Or
yeah, so I think when so a moratorium is really necessary when there are questions of equity, right? When you inequitable collaborations. And H3 Africa actually adopted such an approach, and they said within a period of 9 months, no one can use that data. And I think it is good because it gives researchers with less resources the ability to, or the time to publish their data. What I see as a problem may be enforcement, whether at the end of that 9 months we can take action, because at the end of the day we have data sitting there for 5 years down the line. No publications has come out of it. There has not been any community engagement or public engagement activity to even say this is what we found, and there should be a stop at some point. And I think that if we see genetics data as a public good, then we should think about those embargo periods, and to say what is much more feasible and what benefits the researcher versus what benefits the public. But I see the importance of putting an embargo on use of data.
It's fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so we don't have any more questions in the chat. So I guess if that's it, we can end here. So thank you once again. And that brings a close to this week of webinars. So thank you to everyone who joined us, whether remote or, oh, we might have a question actually from Afia.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was just trying to put in my question via texting, then realized the session was just about to close. Sorry, I joined in late, far away in Australia. I thought it was 8. Yeah, so my question is, I'm going to put through the videos of these presentations for some of us who joined late or something couldn't join and all that.
So yes, the sessions are being live streamed on YouTube. So if you go to the African Society for Human Genetics YouTube channel, you'll be able to find all of the webinars from this week.
Okay, thank you very much. And my next question is, so I am a nurse currently doing my PhD here in Western Australia. Now, I have previously worked with the newborn screening for sickle cell disease in Ghana for some time, since 2011. I am a genetic counselor and wondering what nurses' roles are within this setup. What are we doing as far as genetics and nursing is concerned? Because having been a counselor in sickle cell, I realized that there is a gap even with genetic education for our clients, because sometimes the information that goes out to the community, it's quite different, you know, when you understand what is really going on as far as, for instance, genetics of sickle cell disease is concerned. So what is this platform doing in bridging the gap as far as nurses are concerned in terms of genetics? And again, if there are people, for instance, I am interested in genetics. I am a member of nurses in genetics. I've joined ISONG, and I'm wondering, as far as Africa is concerned, what are we doing for nurses interested in genetics on this platform? So that's my next question.
Thanks, Afia.
Mm-hmm.
So the first is that there is an African genomic medicine training initiative hosted by the H3A Bionet, and it developed a course on genetic medicine for nurses in Africa.
Okay.
So that course is available. It is it's done once a year. It's a blended, they use a blended learning approach, and people can host classes across Africa. And the goal,
sorry, just sorry to cut in. Can you share your email and then links to these? I'll just pop in my email address as well, and then if you can share these information so that perfect. I'm going to copy that and then contact you so that I can have more in-depth knowledge in what is going on and how far I can also gain knowledge in genetics in Africa, to be precise. Yeah.
Thanks, Afia.
Yeah, so I wouldn't board others.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and thank you so much.